I've been dealing with code in some way since I was a teenager, like 14, 15, specifically with video games and trying to hack them initially, which will come into play later when I talk about cybersecurity. The role title was VP Security Architecture. It was basically any system that's going on the Morgan Stanley network, whether it's public facing, internal facing, moves money, moves people's private data. We've seen extremely famous people in the records during investigations that I obviously can't share, but extremely high needing to secure their data and of course like having lots of money moving through their accounts. Our team would be in charge of reviewing each and every one of these, which was a huge task and obviously very expensive as well. We rolled out a huge vaccine program, which was sort of competing with the government program at the time. Most healthcare software right now is designed as a SaaS product, like a software as a service. It's trying to be more like a Spotify than the NHS website. But what it needs to be is more like the NHS website. It needs to be super accessible, super clean, not very flashy. Attackers don't wait for when you're prepared, right? So they usually strike, and we had this attack, I think it was like December 25th, when all of the bank, it's going to be a skeleton crew. And so you might get denied for treatment. They might say, oh, we know that you smoke. And you might be like, well, you got to prove that, but are you really going to go against a huge insurance company? And so these are the kinds of things that I think are really scary. Beats me, dude, honestly. It's very weird. It's like we don't have any companies in the UK that can do this. I highly doubt that. I think that a lot of people are expecting that the AI is going to do the entire job. As you said, Elon Musk talking about AI surgeons.
Welcome back. In this episode of The Business of Clinic, we have Bharat, who's our CTO at Coherent Healthcare. He's actually talking to me from India, the other side of the planet. It'll be good to have a short intro for people who are not familiar with you and your background.
Yeah, for sure. My background is software engineering through and through. I've been dealing with code in some way since I was a teenager, probably like 14, 15, specifically with video games and trying to hack them initially, which will come into play later when I talk about cybersecurity. I went to uni in the UK. So I grew up in India, went to uni in the UK, went to study artificial intelligence. This was a time when, AI wasn't that popular. And so the only careers after that were more research oriented. And so my kind of reason I went into software was to have a lot of impact. And so after uni, I decided to go into financial services. I went to Morgan Stanley, one of the premier investment banks on the street. I went into a sort of tech career, went on the grad program. I joined as a sort of cybersecurity architect, but played many roles throughout the career. So kind of did infrastructure engineering, more front office app development, and then of course cybersecurity and sort of risk management and governance. And then I kind of, I did that for close to a decade. I felt like it was a great experience. I learned a lot and a lot about organizational structure and how that works. And then decided to move to somewhere I would have more impact. So went to a smaller scale startup that was, serving almost 100% of GPs in the UK. We rolled out a huge vaccine program, which was sort of competing with the government program at the time. So it was really impactful work, really high stress, but, rewarding as well. And so I wanted to continue that journey. And so then I met Jared a few years later, and he was talking about the sort of more difficult problems that a clinic is having around how do you run the business of a clinic. And so kind of joined as the lead dev, became CTO, and the rest is history.
Coming from finance, what surprised you most about the reality of healthcare technology once you were inside of it?
Yeah, I mean, probably two things I can think of off the bat. So one is that it's the legacy problem is almost the same. There are extremely old systems in banks, close to 20, 30, 40, 50, I don't even know if we can have a 50-year-old system at this point, but they do, right? So they have mainframes that they have to plug new stuff into. Healthcare is not that different. So there are a lot of legacy systems in healthcare. The other thing that surprised me was probably sort of the focus on sort of security and governance. Some of this might be that banking is maybe slightly more regulated or has sort of more impact when it goes wrong, but it surprised me that actually finance felt more highly regulated, especially in the software side. So we're not talking about medical devices, that's a whole different kettle of fish, but sort of all the software around actually supporting patients and administration is not as regulated, but I think that's starting to change. So I think with the EU AI Act and how it is talking about healthcare, I think it's all starting to converge a little bit.
Yeah, that's interesting. So as I understood, you build tech for people at their most vulnerable. That's a way to look at it, I guess, one way to look at it. For example, Crisis at Christmas, apps to protect children's data at NSPCC, teaching data hygiene at Code Club. How did that work change the way you build healthcare software?
So in finance, especially in an investment bank, I think, and this goes back to sort of having impact. It's you're not actually serving your everyday people necessarily, right? You're not serving, the people that you would encounter in a GP practice, for example. So these vulnerable populations have different requirements to your regular people. And I think only now, so if you look at the NHS website, for example, or like a Gov UK website, you can see the accessibilities there, and they give a lot of guidance on like how to serve these people. That is just not really there in most healthcare software. Most healthcare software right now is designed, as a SaaS product, like a software as a service. It's trying to be more like a Spotify than the NHS website. But what it needs to be is more like the NHS website. It needs to be super accessible, super clean, not very flashy, So yeah, I would say that.
We're going to cover quite a bit around NHS and the company that you're very familiar with, that you've been quite outspoken about on LinkedIn later. I feel like I jumped the gun that we went straight into your finance and cybersecurity background and experience. Let's take a step back, talk about your personal story. Like, you were born and raised in India, or was it that you moved from India to the UK? Tell me more about your backdrop story. Because I remember you were mentioning that your dad was a military personnel in the UK.
Yep. Oh, no. So he was actually military in the Indian Air Force. So he was like a fighter pilot, test pilot, which I guess like somewhat inspired the systems thinking and, all of that stuff.
Like Top Gun.
Basically, yeah. Also inspired my love and quotability, my ability to quote Top Gun at any moment. But yeah, so I grew up in India. So until basically university, I was in India. But what happens in the Indian Air Force is you get shipped around every 3 or 4 years. So you meet a whole bunch of like different people from all around the country. And sometimes you're in like Kashmir, right? Very forward base where, like there's very little. There's only the military and then obviously the cities and stuff like that. Very low populations, and then like very dense population centers like New Delhi or Mumbai. So it was quite a good experience to sort of like, just understand that the world is very large. And then I think it really helped when I went to the UK, of course, to, sort of like, because obviously the UK is very multicultural. And as I said, there are many different types of populations, even in London. And so like being able to think about and empathize about what those people might be feeling when they're looking at your software has been super valuable.
You don't have to associate software development with every aspect of your life.
I've
What happened in reality? So you moved from India to the UK when you were 17, 16?
Around that, yeah, 16, I think. Yeah.
Around that. And then you went to university straight in the UK? So what was the reason you chose AI? Because when was it? Like that was 20 years ago or more than 20 years ago?
Well, yeah, probably the choice would have been made around 20 years ago. Or so.
At that time, AI wasn't the very popular topic as it is of today. Definitely. What was the reason that you chose AI, the major that you focus on in uni?
I think I just heard about the Turing test. I think I'd heard about it from school, just like I had a very inspirational teacher. And it really blew me away that like, Alan Turing, I don't know exactly when it was, like probably in the 70s, suggested the Turing test, which talks about if you're speaking to a machine and you cannot tell if it's a machine, and you're just having a chat, if you cannot tell if it's a machine or a human, then it's passed the Turing test. It means that it's a sentient being, basically, right? So I wanted to build that. So I was trying at like 15, and I built this huge if condition thing that just like had lots of branches and tried to predict like everything that the user would ever say. And obviously it never worked. It would never get past like 6 chat session exchanges. But yeah, that it kind of inspired me to look into it more. Of course, I don't think Wikipedia was necessarily a huge thing, or like maybe it was very hard to access for us back then. But so I spoke to my obviously teacher, and then I spoke to some people at the university, and they this was one of the few universities that was doing the course. So I think there were like 5 or 6 in the UK that were doing the course at the time. And we had this crazy faculty of very expert people that were at the forefront of neural network sort of discovery and stuff. So that really inspired me, and I basically figured I had no choice. And I was already quite familiar with a number of computer science concepts, so I thought, let me try and push myself. I think on the very first day, we had a class on classical propositional logic, they called it, and there's a language called Prolog, and the language basically is designed to answer like logic puzzles almost. So, for example, you might say like, oh, it rained yesterday, it's raining today. A computer might conclude that it's going to rain tomorrow, but if you layer in additional logic and you arrive at an answer somehow that is that it might not rain tomorrow, right? And so I guess progressing with that, 2 years in, I learned about neural networks, convolutional neural networks, which sort of formed the basis of the research that went to machine learning, which then, sort of forms a part of, what Claude and all of these guys use in addition to LLMs. But yeah, it was clear to me that my approach was never going to work on the very first day.
And what was the biggest takeaway from your journey? I mean, I've never studied computer science. I'm tech savvy, but I'm never technical as a marketer. What was your biggest takeaway that after completing the course, completing your degree in AI, that you found that you knew that this is completely different from other subjects or degree focus? The reason why I asked this question was I did law in uni at the very beginning, and within 2 years I realized that it wasn't a subject for me, which was obviously too late after 2 years of failing the course, some prerequisite course more than 4 times. But I spoke with a colleague who also did law and successfully completed, but she never actually went on to become a lawyer or solicitor. And her takeaway after completing the law degree was that the legal course or the law degree helped her to think differently. So obviously you can apply that logic to any other course. But I'm just curious, was there anything that's unique about the computer science or AI degree that you did that you knew that's so completely different from other courses?
Yeah, I think this actually goes back a little bit to my earlier point around, sort of like my step after uni was not actually to go into AI research. And I think it was because actually it wasn't even computer science, because we were doing computer science, software engineering, and AI, right? And so software engineering bits, which are like the practical application of computer science concepts, was the thing that I was really drawn to. And so what I wanted to do was bring the computer science and the AI into that and take that forward. And so I think the thing that sort of made it clear was just almost every project that I would do had a real world application, right? In the database class, we'd be designing an e-commerce website. And obviously I wasn't studying, at university to just do e-commerce websites, but just seeing all of these modules that are so applicable. Whereas you speak to someone who's studying philosophy and, it is very applicable, of course, but it's very hard to have a conversation and provide the value to others. I think that really solidified that computer science, software engineering, AI would be the future for me.
Yeah, the practical side of AI rather than just the theoretical or research side of AI, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess contrasting it to other places where you build stuff, the physical world where you might build stuff, even a building, you've got an architect who takes months and months to sort of make sure that everything is as it should be, and then it takes years to actually build the thing. In software, you can do that in a day, right? And that's it's a crazy feeling, and especially with what we're seeing now with AI, how much quicker you can stand up massive systems, and obviously that comes with a massive foot gun as well. Yeah, it's a very exciting time.
And then after uni, you went on to join Morgan Stanley?
Yep.
I didn't get it wrong this time. Good. No. And then you went on to progress to become VP of Technology or VP of...
So the role title was VP Security Architecture, was basically any system that's going on the Morgan Stanley network, whether it's public facing, internal facing, moves money, moves people's private data. We've seen extremely famous people in the records during investigations that I obviously can't share, but extremely high needing to secure their data, and of course having lots of money moving through their accounts. Our team would be in charge of reviewing each and every one of these, which was a huge task and obviously very expensive as well.
It sounds like a pretty mission critical function for the bank, right? How big was the team?
So full-time employees, I think in the end we had about 20, but we supported by I think 60 sort of contractors. And you can tell it's crazy, right, in terms of manpower, because security at the time especially was you've really got to train in the way that the attacker is thinking in order to then figure out what they might do, right?
So the red teaming.
Well, so security architecture is really interesting because there is a very important red team component, but like it's like an open book exam in that like we're speaking to the developers, and it's also like a little bit of like people skills, because you have to because you are the reviewer, and you can prevent them from going to production. You can delay their project by 2 months and get them fired or whatever it is, right? Because these are very high stakes projects. So like that could happen, but you've got to get them on your side to give you the information about the system that will help you understand whether there might be a risk, or like what the risk might be and what the impact might be. And so yeah, it was kind of like a balancing act of sort of being the police as well as the trainer for
or criminal.
I guess so, yeah.
So think like the criminal, but then it reminds me of the Catch Me If You Can.
Yeah, well, we actually used to do, we used to go to like Oxford University, Cambridge University, like all of these guys, and do a class called, you can probably see like recordings online, Think Like a Hacker. And so we would basically have this like sort of web application that looked very much like a banking app, and then take them through like all of the attacks that are possible on a typical web app that's deployed, that was being deployed by people, thankfully outside the bank, but like, not we were able to control that somewhat. But yeah, security is not easy, and as a developer you're not really paid for security, right? I mean, ultimately you are, but when you're doing the development, that's not what you're thinking about, and so you kind of need some help, I think.
It sounds like the responsibility is huge, not only after the security or cybersecurity side of things at such a massive bank, but also essentially you are the person, or that role itself is take on full accountability and responsibility of the cybersecurity of the entire investment bank across the globe. Is that correct?
100%. So if there's an incident, which there have been, and so I remember that, and the funny thing is like attackers don't wait for when you're prepared, right? So they usually strike, and we had this attack, I think it was like December 25th, when all of the bank, it's going to be a skeleton crew, and somebody chose that moment to sort of do the attack. And so you get a call, right? You get a call from the MD who's like responsible for that department, so like fixed in or whatever it is, department it is, and they're looking at your report, which you've written the sort of executive summary, and they're only trying to like glean the information of like, how did this happen? And so, yeah, I think like you just have to do a lot of the work up front, and it's almost like case law in a sense, right? Where you kind of make the decision, and 2 years or 3 years later it might come back and bite you. But yeah, it's a thing that applies to any company, right? Like somebody's taking the accountability. We had quite good structures, I think, around sort of like a first person look at it, and you have a peer review, and so most things would get caught. And of course, like things would slip through, but that's just the nature of security.
Yeah, it's interesting because even though it's completely different vertical, different industry, different sector, but the essence about cyber of the work that you've done back in the days in such a huge investment bank, there seems to be so many similarities that applies directly to healthcare. It's because it's such a data sensitive industry or sector. What is the thing or two or three things that you found very similar throughout the time that you worked at Morgan Stanley as the VP of Security Architect, comparing to the CTO of patient ops, managing patient ops for now over 100,000 patients now globally, and soon to be very many more?
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I think I touched on the legacy point earlier. So I guess, the fact that there is a lot of legacy system, and, every kind of like, even in finance, like every startup, is coming to the bank and being like, oh, we've got this new way of doing things, and like, we can take your data and make it, really clear what's happening, and, guide your decisions, and, do like decision support, which, decision support is a big thing in healthcare as well. But the data is like totally siloed, right? And some of the data might even be in healthcare, it might be on the insurer side. In finance, it might just be in a different team or like a different department where you've got these like ethical walls. You've got sort of like information barriers. And so that's very similar to what happens in healthcare, which is that you've got sort of information silos because you've got sort of smaller providers maybe, and then you've got the insurer involved, and they're not as willing to sort of share data. So that's kind of one thing that comes to mind.
What was the thing that you miss back in the days working as a VP of Security Architect at Morgan Stanley that you currently miss from now? Because since then you worked for smaller companies and much smaller company.
At this moment, I think it's the impact, right? So I think in my previous startup, obviously we were serving most of the NHS GP population. It was Yeah, like you push a change and it might affect a lot of people, but you also fix a bug and it might affect a lot of people. Right now, we're doing a very different job here at Coherent, which is we're trying to figure out a better way of operating for healthcare clinics, and so we're necessarily constraining ourselves because we want to make sure that for the population of clinics that we have sort of served them well and solved that problem. So I have no doubt we will get there eventually. I think it's going to be like sort of much more sort of stressful and a difficult job at that stage than the financial services bit, because I think there's a lot of regulation coming down, especially with the stuff we're working with, on the AI side. And so if you think of the EU Privacy Act, it's again, mentions healthcare and is quite, considers it quite important to sort of like at least register, all of the ways that data is flowing around of EU subjects. I mean, I think that's a good thing. It's also making sure that like any decisions that are being made are traceable back to which AI or which sort of context generated it.
Interesting, the word regulation. You've lived and breathed bank grade regulation, right? Mm-hmm. And for now, if you could write the rules for AI in healthcare, what would good regulation actually look like, and what should it get out of the way of?
So, I mean, I guess like I would probably want to apply the cybersecurity architect hat again and go like, well, what is the impact of the thing you're building? And so if it's us, I think like some of this EU Privacy Act stuff actually makes a lot of sense, because if you're making a decision about whether something is clinical or is administrative, so that then we can process it or we can escalate it to the clinic, you need to have sort of traceability of that decision, especially if that decision then leads on to sort of a chain that ends with, some kind of incident. Somebody's going to ask, like, where did all these sort of decisions come from? And so the accountability there, of course, you would hope that there's a human involved, but as these system links sort of get more complex, it becomes much more difficult to reason about those. So I think setting the foundation now for kind of an audit layer to say, why was this decision made? Like, why did the agent make this decision is going to be paramount.
Yeah, I mean, there is currently a loud debate about who should hold NHS and patient data. Set the politics aside, from a pure architecture standpoint, what does doing data sovereignty right look like, in your view?
It's a very difficult question to answer, and I think that's why people are reaching for easy solutions and sort of saying, kicking it over the wall and trusting some other company that doesn't necessarily operate in the country or have your ideals at heart to sort of figure it out. I think what it could look like is, I think of like OAuth authentication, right? So if you think about like login with Facebook or login with Google that you see all over the web, that is a federated data model, right? Because Google or Facebook holds your identity. You go to like, Peloton.com or whatever it is, and you sign in with your Google account, and Peloton only receives what you authorize Google to share, right? So I think that we basically fundamentally need to change the architecture about how systems take actions, because it's you can no longer say that it's definitely a system or definitely a human. Now the lines are kind of blurring, and so I think a federation layer of sorts would be helpful, and I think it could enable a lot as well, right? Because it could enable people to sort of like set up sort of information repositories which have controlled access, and it's the user ultimately who decides, do I want this agent to be able to take this action using the data from all of these other sources that I might have configured, or no, I'm not comfortable with that. But like right now, the decision is not in the hands of the users, it's not in the hands of patients. And in fact, like with the latest things we're hearing about, especially from the NHS, it turns out that if you choose to opt out of sharing your data, it doesn't actually work, because that the contract is not covered by that particular legislation. So people aren't even aware that they can't opt out. And I think that ultimately that is going to result in a huge trust problem in this amazing, sort of system of AI that like obviously is delivering a lot of value, and we need to find a way to apply it well. But like going full steam ahead on, exposing data to everyone in the hopes that you might conclude something seems kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about that quite a lot today. But as a total layman about cybersecurity, what could go wrong? Like using the NHS example that you shared, I think you previously talked about it before. For example, one person's patient data, I don't know, one patient is taking a treatment at this particular hospital, and that data will be exposed to potential commercial use. But that sounds quite vague. Obviously, as I mentioned, I'm a layman, so this is not something that I'm fully aware or understand of. What could go wrong when it comes to security as an issue for the healthcare sector?
Yeah. So I guess let's think of a company, right, that has access to disparate data sets and is being given access to more. So company X, right? And so X, what they're doing is basically...
Well, X is now a real company, so maybe use a different...
Yeah. Right. Well, let me think. The Sauron company, right? Let's call it the Sauron. Is that allowed? Can I say that? Right. So Sauron decides that they want to get into the world of data and help governments, get to grips with the data and improve the efficiency, blah, blah, blah. So first they get access to NHS data. So they'll get access to wide demographic data, not super personal. It won't say Sean did this, right? It'll say this person of this age, from the sort of went to this school, has a partner, doesn't have a partner, what have you, this kind of metadata around the actual work being done in the NHS is being shared with this company, with Sauron, right? Then Sauron goes to the Metropolitan Police of the UK and says, hey, I'd love some data from you because I could help you actually, police better, right? And so now they have data, let's say on, more things around, what the police is seeing, right? And so the police, for example, is also doing facial recognition on the streets now of the UK, right? So they've got a van there that's sort of watching stuff happen. And so let's say this company Sauron is also, it's a private entity, right? So it can do whatever it wants. And so it goes to contract with an insurance agency, a medical insurance agency. So now you've got these 3 disparate data sets, none of which identify Sean necessarily, but which can potentially pinpoint Sean to say, yeah, hey, I saw Sean actually, or I saw a person that fits the demographic of Sean because I had a visual image of someone like that. Then, I've got public information on this person, Sean, right? That's definitely just out there. And then I've got a bunch of very sensitive data around, which healthcare clinics are involved, what types of treatments are involved, heights, weights, all of this stuff. And so all of this information together actually become, it's possible to, and then potentially target, and so the Sauron company is never going to do this, right? But it's going to provide data to other people who might have control over your life, like medical insurers. And so you might get denied for treatment, or they might say, oh, we know that you smoke, and you might be well, you got to prove that, but are you really going to go against a huge insurance company? And so these are the kinds of things that I think are really scary.
Do you think the way to avoid that is better regulation and better security architecture across different stakeholders?
Yeah, I think security architecture is paramount, absolutely. So if you think about federated access to data, that is a fundamental architecture thing where the security is sort of built in, but ultimately it's the architecture of the system, not really the security architecture, right? So security architecture is almost a misnomer. It should be a thing that's sort of designed in from the start. Yeah.
It's funny that as a marketer in the industry for close to 2 decades, every day we strive for more data, extract more data from consumers or our ideal customers through digital data capture format. Obviously, for anybody who know about the iOS 14 changes a couple of years back, or all the challenges that Google faced to capture more data to provide marketers to stitch up consumer journey across different channels, different devices, different platforms, so that advertisers or marketers for commercial entities will do a better job by analyzing, understanding consumers better so that we can sell better to these people. Now, looking at it from your lens, from a different side, to see the potential massive problems, especially when it comes to super sensitive data with regards to healthcare. It's not, oh, I'm interested in this pair of shoes, I'm interested in this gym membership, and this is actually life and death related. So I feel like it's very interesting to see now this is a very different level of seriousness.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, ultimately data is a resource, right? And we should exploit it. We should try and understand the data to make our processes better. But we should not, absolutely, willy-nilly distribute the data and hope that we can trust private companies to keep it secure. I guess my question to you would be, how does it make you feel that, like, yeah, you know, everything you're hearing about what is happening to your NHS data, I assume you've been to an NHS practice at some point. How's that sitting?
Yeah, good question. And I think there's a range in terms of severity. Severity, is that the right word? I don't even know now. From on the spectrum of, I'm openly and willingly giving away my intent data because I'm interested in certain products, or I'm interested in certain kind of services on Facebook, on Google, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, wherever. But on the other side of the spectrum is I do not want to share if I have a heart condition, if I have obesity condition, if I have, migraine, etc. So there is a line that consumer or individuals or member of public should have control of, and then is up to vendors or providers or service providers or a government to provide that option for the consumers to make that choice, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very interesting. You mentioned sort of e-commerce like Google, all of these guys. I think it was not very within the last couple of years that they found, the Facebook app was collecting data that it wasn't supposed to. And so I think it was like fingerprinting the device and then tying that. And so, like, we're sort of like, you're rightfully worried about your extremely private health data where you think there are sort of good controls and you now realizing there might not be. And over here on e-commerce, it's not even that like regulated. And we kind of said, okay, well, maybe we can trust these companies to do it. And you just can't. You can't trust a private entity in the system that we work in to sort of like police itself, right? And that's why we absolutely, like, it's an interesting one of like, how much regulation do you need? And the more you add, definitely the more you stifle innovation. But yeah, I think we can probably change the balance a little bit better.
So yeah, let's talk about the company that's currently getting a lot of attention, especially in the UK at the moment, Palantir. So in the space of months, the same vendor has ended up under both the NHS and Met Police pilot. There's more interesting twists and turns. Set the company aside, what's making governments reach for one platform, one single commercial platform, to fuse all their data right now?
Beats me, dude. Honestly, like, it's very weird. It's like we don't have any companies in the UK that can do this. Like, I highly doubt that. Like, technology.
That's regulated in the UK, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Would you say that the problem was that there is no UK equivalent of Palantir? Palantir essentially they have a UK entity, right? The headquarters is based in the US.
I think it is enough when you have GDPR and privacy regulation applying. But this company is basically saying, well, we're receiving anonymized data, or we are anonymizing, or, like, they'll have a lot of different, obviously, fingers in many pies, and so there might be different ways they're ingesting the data. But ultimately, they're saying, well, the data is not anonymized, and so it's no longer a UK entity. It's like all being sent to the US, right? Then the question is, one of the reasons like people use Coherent is that we are very transparent in the way we move data around. And so we do use one of the foundational model providers who are hosted in the US. They don't have any compute, or they won't do all the inference in the UK. So we have to send data over to the US. And so for that, we have gone through our privacy notice, consulted with lawyers, all of this to figure out the pathway for making that happen. Where that applies can be made safe. Some of the things we assess in that are like, so what is the relationship between the UK and the US? Are there any extradition treaties? Would the US courts respect the judgment that the UK handed down? What is the political climate like? Is the Supreme Court in control of the president? Stuff like that. But also it's like the risk landscape is kind of shifting all the time, especially now the partnership between the UK and the US is not as great as it once was. Basically, you can enforce controls. I think it's very advantageous to be able to use software and technology from other parts of the world to provide better service. But that process seems like it's been completely bypassed because we're thinking it's anonymized data. But we know even from places like the NSA, where they're able to target people with what they call metadata, that once you have a large enough data set, it's no longer anonymous.
So let's say if an NHS trust asked you, where does our data really live and who can compel it? How many vendors do you think could answer that cleanly?
I don't know if I would be able to give you a good answer to that, but anecdotally from the how quickly the industry wants to go to like solve problems, I would be very surprised if it was 50%. And I think it's a question also of the bigger players are going to be better regulated, but they'll obviously be in many more systems. And so there might be a better story around risk there. But like most of the innovation is not coming from there, right? And so you got to make sure that as these companies grow and scale, that they obviously are very, switched on about data privacy and security.
For leaders listening who will never sign a 330 million deal, but face the same choice at a much smaller scale, let's say 1 site clinic, 2 sites, or maybe 10 to 20 sites, sometimes 50 sites, right? It's a lesson from the Palantir story for their next vendor call. So everybody's adopting AI one way or another, faster or slower, but eventually, inevitably, everybody would adopt more AI solutions. Yeah, so what's the lesson that they can take from all this?
My advice would probably be to make the best call around what your clinic needs and consult the right people before you do that. And so I would say, even if it's not a $330 million deal, but let's say you've got to make deals worth $1 million, right? Is it likely that one vendor is going to be able to satisfy all of those and be the most effective, vendor for doing that, and is going to be like at the forefront of technology, and is going to be like sort of, good with regulation? I think probably unlikely, right? Because there's just so much that happens in a healthcare clinic, as you know. So I think it would be to like sort of break down the problem, and what that would ideally result in is kind of like a number of vendors. And of course, we very much say like people don't want more software; they don't want more like sort of like breakage in their data sets. But I think the model is changing, where you've kind of got this agentic system that's kind of ingesting a lot of data from a lot of different places. So it's almost like not even a problem anymore, right? But they have to change the way they operate to take advantage of that. But yeah, I think it would be like just follow the procurement process that sort of like you should be doing.
Yeah. What about, let's say, a clinic owner who runs 10 clinics, 10 sites, right, in the MSK space? Is there some sort of checklist, let's say in your head, as a cybersecurity expert professional that held such a senior role in such a highly regulated investment bank, right, a global investment bank? What kind of checklist that comes up in your head that a clinic owner who runs 10 sites or 20 sites should go through when they consider an AI solution?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Obviously, a bunch of certificates, if a vendor that check certain boxes.
Yeah.
What are these boxes?
I guess like the very first one would probably be kind of like where are they hosted and what kind of regulations apply to them. The data, like I guess the clinic's data.
Patient data.
Patient data especially. And so patient data, in the UK, for example, is affected by GDPR. And so I would want to go and like understand what are the requirements that GDPR places on data processors in this case, because I as a clinic owner, I'm the data controller. I give my data over to someone and they are the processor. And so what requirements do those people need to fulfill? One of the things they need to have is a data processing agreement, maybe a privacy notice. And so are those things in place? Are they very clear? Do the things that they're saying in the sales call agree with like what's written over there? Some other things I would probably look at, independent penetration tests or like independent security reviews. And so these are kind of like not the end all be all, because like obviously, so as a security architect, it's very helpful to understand the internals of the system to understand where the risks might be. But this is a very basic check that you might ask someone to have, right? Have you had an independent security review from a third party firm? And then I'd probably look at who they are sending the data to and whether the data is being minimized, because you might have to contract a Facebook, or you might have to contract a variety of vendors like Google or whatever, because you want to drive revenue into your clinic, but you don't need to send them a whole bunch of data, right? You can get away with trying to minimize the data. So my question there would be, even with these AI service providers, they will be using foundational AI models behind them to do the inference, and they might have models themselves, sure, but like most of the time they're at least relying somewhat on those sort of Anthropics and OpenAIs of the world. So I would very clearly ask them, what data are you sending to these people?
What do you think the AI in healthcare is going to be in the next 2 to 5 to 10 years? And we talked about this before. We believe even Elon says on multiple occasions where he thinks that AI surgeon or robot surgeon will be so much better, so much more accurate than a real surgeon, human surgeon. But everybody knows what his timeline is like. He promised something, and then Tesla is a great example. What do you think in the next 2 to 5 to 10 years, AI in healthcare will realistically look like in terms of development, in terms of adoption, etc.?
I think there's going to be a lot more kind of decision support systems. I think that a lot of people are expecting that the AI is going to do the entire job. As you said, Elon Musk talking about AI surgeons, and, probably will be definitely more reliable and, don't have to take breaks and don't have to go on vacation, and all of that stuff is very good for the consumer, of course. But yeah, I think it's going to be a mixed bag of like some of the stuff we're seeing is just going to die away because it's like the sort of information architecture is not where it needs to be. Like data is not freely accessible, but where it is and where you have sort of a lot of context coming in, like decision support, I think that's going to be, that is going to take off. I think especially more on the back end, these huge sort of clinical research data sets, they're going to yield a lot of results. I think even kind of like treatment data, the kind of which is being sent to Palantir at the moment, I think is also like a very kind of area for exploitation. So I think a lot of like data specific data forward companies are going to come out that are going to potentially replace consultancies. But yeah, I think the more interesting space is going to be sort of the more interactive bits around, in the clinic, all of these patient interactions, and even outside the clinic, the patient interactions, what, can we improve there?
Quickly talk about Coherent itself, the engineering team at Coherent. What is the rough percentage of code currently being written by AI at Coherent? Not patient data. I'm not talking about patient data. I'm just talking about the code that builds the software that the engineering teams are actively developing. Apparently, Claude is using Claude code to write.
We're very much like Anthropic, people that make Claude. We are 100% in on Claude code. And, of course,
we're writing 100% of the code with Claude code.
100% of the code with Cloud Code. So, sometimes engineers do try other models for coding. Nothing has so far seems to have stuck. One of our main advantages is that we get really deep on the clinic's data. We understand the context of what's happening and try and exploit that. And so we have non-engineers using Cloud Code to spin up sort of dashboards, like more like, sales and account management are playing data analysis roles to sort of help that process, to help the clinics even before they've come on to understand their data and maybe exploit it. And so that would be the one place where maybe like us as engineers sometimes go in and tweak a few variables of like a SQL query that's on a dashboard to like help someone out. But most of the time, no, literally everyone is just using Cloud Code now. Great.
Interesting. Let's say you're speaking to a clinic owner who's considering Coherent products, the technology part of the product. And let's say this clinic owner has concerns over their patient data, right? All clinic owners essentially are very protective to their patient data, of course, as they should. Mm-hmm. What would you say to this clinic owner who have concerns over their patient data? And what kind of precautionary steps that Coherent's taken to ensure everything is good?
Taking back to security architecture, we always think of sort of defense in depth. And the Swiss cheese model is another thing.
What was a Swiss cheese
model?
You've got
a block of like Swiss cheese. If you have layers of slices of Swiss cheese, they tend to have holes in them, right? And so that's your system. That's the way that the attacker gets in. And so if you layer enough of those, ultimately the holes all get blocked up, right? And so you've kind of got to layer in a number of defenses. And so we make sure that we work with model providers that can guarantee certain things. So one of the things they guarantee is zero data retention. It might be, in the US, if we're serving clinics in the US now, when we serve them, they ask for HIPAA compliance. We make sure that the vendor is responsive enough that they will speak to us and sign an agreement with us. We obviously also minimize the data that is actually sent out to only the thing that is required to make a decision. And so if it is a decision around a calendar, let's say, so like, for example, we try and automate bookings of patients. And specifically, we try and automate an understanding of the calendar to know where the patient is most appropriately placed, right? So which practitioner is able to do the treatment, who would they prefer, is that practitioner in? And so all of this is data that's fed into the model. to, at the end of the day, figure out some slots. And so we don't send, clinical data to that. You don't need the patient's name. You don't need any of the patient's data. You just need to solve this mathematical problem that doesn't involve any privacy concerns. And so we try and make sure that we're thinking about all these data flows outside of our system and making sure that they're done in the most effective way possible, least privilege, least information.
That reminds me of something that we previously spoken with extremely large private healthcare organizations, very senior decision makers. Putting on your previous hat of VP of Cybersecurity architect role at Morgan Stanley, imagining that you're giving them advice of 3 steps or 5 steps when taking on a new vendor that's an AI solution that deliver whatever outcome that they promised to do, what would be the 3 steps you would advise them to do that covers the basis, covers all the holes in the Swiss cheese model of cybersecurity concerns?
First one that comes to mind is the very boring one, which is multi-factor authentication, or making sure your passwords are strong and they're not password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which surprisingly
for patient data.
For access to any systems that you have, systems of the clinic. Because I guess the interesting thing is, of course, the clinic, you care deeply about patient data, but you also care about your competitive advantage, which is, your financial data, your commerce model, all of those things. Things shouldn't be exposed either, right? So yeah, authentication, big. I would say probably look at I think if you're running any of your own sort of systems, which increasingly, sort of mid-sized clinics are, they'll bring in a dev for a few months and they'll build a system. Has that been reviewed by, again, independent security audit? And if you are not ready for that or don't want to deal with that right now, which is perfectly fine, then I think you need to make sure that your developer is sort of security conscious, and or you're making sure you have an idea about what is happening to that system. So GIAC is a security organization that provides training, and so they have a very popular course called the bootcamp. And so one of the main things that I took away from that was an investigation approach, where if you look at the connections that a system is making, if you look at the longest held connections, the kind of connections sending the most data, and so the connections that are, well, I guess I said longest, the thing that is making the most connections, potentially to the same place. If you look at that, most of the time you find that there is a vulnerability in the app, which is kind of like a worm or a thing that's gotten in and is kind of exfiltrating the data, sending it to, nation states that might not be very friendly to your company. So yeah, that's kind of like a more advanced, maybe control. But I think if you decide to take on this kind of custom development work, then just realize that it comes with a lot of stuff that is normally taken care of by the software provider for you. And so you need to be thinking about security whenever you're rolling things out.
Yeah. Very interesting. Great to have you on today. And I'm looking forward to our future conversations. And for anyone who wants to follow you on LinkedIn, actually, that's the wrong thing to ask.
Yeah, why's that?
Because you don't use Twitter, there's no handle, etc. But
yeah.
Sorry. For anyone who's interested in following your thoughts and ideas on LinkedIn, we'll add your LinkedIn handle and LinkedIn profile link in the show notes. And any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess the thing that always surprises me is that how much people, even in healthcare, maybe care more about the financial aspect of things than the health aspect of things. And so, it's fine. It's the lifeblood of the clinic, right? If you don't have that, then you're not going to have a clinic and you're not going to be able to serve your patients. So that is very interesting. But I think, yeah, we need to shift focus on to thinking about data privacy and being much more clear with our vendors about what we will accept and won't. And that only comes from understanding it yourself, right? Take off the sunglasses, look around at what's happening in the data security world.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Bharat. And looking forward to the next one. And until then, have a great day.
All right. See you later.